the Game Design Live Chat. I'm Carla Kopp from Weird Giraffe Games. I'm a designer, developer, publisher, and so is Julie. Julie is an amazing human. She runs Greenbrier Games, and she will give you more of a insight into who she is right now.
Cool. Yes, that's me. Hi. So I'm the vice president and COO of Greenbrier Games. I'm one of the co-founders as well. And so I guess a little background from me. I started in education, designed a lot of educational games. My master's thesis was about how to incorporate board games and gameplay into education to help students learn more effectively. So naturally, I had a lot of gaming groups over the years, and just one of them happened to design a board game about zombies that segued into our first published game, which segued into, hey, let's make this a company, which is now how I'm here. Hi.
Well,
that's the Reader Digest version, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But it's so exciting because you know about educational games, zombie games, and sandbox games, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Oh, well, good. Cool. Yeah.
And tying theme into marketing. So if anyone has questions, feel free to write them or say them. But I'm going to go through the questions that were submitted. So
fantastic.
First off, how would you define a sandbox game?
How would I define a sandbox game?
Yeah, for those of you, those people that haven't played one before.
Fair enough. So it's funny. The first thing I mentally want to do is compare it to your Euro, because that is always, it's like the Coke and Pepsi kind of, or binary of two choices of board gaming predominant categories, I would think. But what a sandbox game is something that is heavy on theme, on storyline, where the rule sets give a lot of wiggle room so that a narrative can kind of shape the gameplay. And so because of that, because rule sets don't always necessarily have to be definitive of every single possibility in the gameplay, they typically are a co-op so that you collaboratively come up with solutions on how to move forward in the game. Objectives they might be point-based, but a lot of times objectives are event-based or some sort of activity-based that you are trying to accomplish as well, because points, when you don't have perfect information or specific pathways to gain them, tend to be a lot harder to justify. You get a lot more bad feels because somebody got a lot of points thanks to more luck driven, which is another thing that a lot of sandbox games are noted of having, a lot more luck based than necessarily skill based, which I will disagree on, but it is something that is commonly said.
Okay. So how did you get started with sandbox games?
So I was a theater girl from early on. I started acting when I was 5. I've done a lot of script writing. So in addition to writing a lot of kids board games, I also wrote a lot of plays, and I played a lot of RPGs, specifically D&D, starting in the 4th grade. So that's my thing. That was always my comfort zone. It's my default go-to. I've only recently started really playing a lot of Euros in the last, I would say getting seriously playing them in the last 5 years even. So not even when I started in the industry, which is not to say I wasn't familiar with them and hadn't played them all along, but they weren't my go-to. Sandbox games have always been my go-to, and I think it's segued in through the storytelling, the pathway. I've also LARPed. Like they're all of that, lend themselves to that type of gameplay. So when I started designing, my comfort zone, when somebody said, well, how are we getting there? I could say, well, I can explain that, and I would write something. And there's a lot of that and a lot of narrative-driven elements to a lot of sandbox games, and that's what I did. That's actually how I started in the company. I was writing character backgrounds and flavor text for all the story moments and events. But of course, being able to shape them in a mechanism-driven way as well made it, as opposed to, hey, that's some cool fan writing you did there. It was more like, hey, could you do that more often? And lots. So just lots. Keep going. So yes, it's funny. So theater, I did acting, but mostly I stage managed. So I did a lot of, here's the creative and how do you organize it? And that's always been where I fall. I'm not super right-brained or left-brained. I like, here's something that's creative. How do I organize it in a functional way? So I don't ever really like going towards Euros. You can't, it's much harder. You have to have a much more organizational way of thinking. And I can only go so far before my brain goes, no, I need to write about something fun or weird or strange. But if I go into full RPGs, especially narrative-driven ones, I can't. I need the structure. So there we are, in the middle.
So what do you think that Sandbox games bring to the table more, differently than RPGs do? Like, why would you choose to play a Sandbox game versus an RPG?
So for an RPG, I feel like you have to bring a lot more of yourself and your own creativity a lot of the times. And not everybody's comfortable doing that. You can, and of course you can develop it over time, but something that a tabletop has is usually a lot more ready-made elements that help support somebody who's gaming, who's interested in being creative but doesn't know how to go about it. It also, an RPG, unless you're doing a one-shot, you are almost always committed to a time commitment. You're committing yourself to a body of time, several weeks, several months. Zach's gaming group, one of my co-founders, has been doing different RPGs, but different story arcs that take at least a year for a decade. That's a commitment of time, and not everybody has that. And obviously, when I was younger, I had more of that kind of a time commitment where I could, blow off other things. Whereas now, I do not. So I think that's also another thing when you need a finite amount of time and it can't be consistent. A tabletop formula is a lot more compact and finite and gives a lot more of that.
I can definitely agree with that. Where like in the past, like I've had times to play D&D. Like I played a D&D campaign for like 3 years, and it was great. But now my life is different, and I can't like do that consistent every week thing. So I think
my first campaign in at least 5 years started because of right now. We're doing it online, Numenaria, 8-week campaign, because I could say, yes, I am housebound for at least 8 weeks. I can commit to that. And it's the first time I've been able to say that in 5 years. And so, for me, it's been great, but also the surreal knowing that every Monday night I have this commitment is it's strange at this point, as opposed to just, hey, let's play a game.
Yeah. I will definitely agree with that because, like, my schedule, we were both doing, like, the nomad thing about the country, and now I'm in the same place for, like, weeks, and it's like, whoa, I can do this thing. I can volunteer to do a Saturday, like, live stream every Saturday, and I'm just going to be at home.
Totally strange, right? It's been, so totally aside from anything like this, you have a sense of self, and everybody has a self-identity that comes from a lot of different things, how you've grown up, what your, potentially religious beliefs, family background, ethnicity, regional, geographical, like there's a lot of different things that make you have a sense of who you are as a person. But one of the predominant things for me for the last couple of years has been I go from convention to convention. That is a huge, huge part of where I was getting my self-identity, and not having it. It's not that I suddenly was like, I don't know who I am anymore, but there was a piece of that, and it's strange. It's strange to, I am the person who travels for our company. I am the whatever, the ambassador of games for Greenbrier. And that's not something I'm doing right now. So what do you do? How do you fill in that sudden vacuum is a strange thing to experience.
Yeah, like for me, I'm also the traveler for Weird Draft Games.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah. But like for me, it was like, oh, well, I'm going to this convention, so I have to have this prototype ready. I have to contact all
Forcing
these people.
deadlines. Yes.
Yeah. And now it's like, I'm going to be at home for 1 year. I guess I could do this at any point in that year, right? But like, that's not a healthy way to look at it.
That is not. I actually leaned into my other major self-identifier is being a writer and a creator, and I'm taking on way too many outside projects. I know this about myself, but I can't help it. So there have been several other companies who are like, hey, would you like to do some writing? And I keep going, yeah, sure, pile it on, because I'm not going anywhere. Which I need to like maybe be realistic about that as well.
Yeah, well, like the thing with that, like, so I've been doing consulting work as well. Is like with consulting work, I have somebody else that wants the work, so I'll get it done.
Yeah, there's that. There is that.
And it's like, oh yeah, this is done, and I'm done with it. So now I can just do whatever I want because there's so much time.
We're also having so Zach and I work. It's actually not that much different because we have not been in the same, usually have not been in the same state, let alone town, for a good couple of years now. So working remotely is kind of the norm, has always been, and we're the ones that are consistently online working together. So that part hasn't really changed. What has changed is Jeff was always evenings and weekends because he works for Bose. And so him being at home and just jumping on and being like, hey guys, what's going on? We're like, whoa. Dude, you're interrupting our flow. I mean, come on. And also we had this really terrible idea to start playing 7 Days to Die again, which we didn't do. Like, we haven't done since the beginning of our, like, when our company started, when it was like an alpha, and it was a zombie video game, and we were making a zombie game. We were like, this is hilarious. So now, like 7 years later, we were like, we should just, get our own, like our own room and just play this. And we're doing that way too often. Like it's like college again, where you're like, hey, you want to just play some video games? Sure. Like, where there are days where I'm like, maybe we should stop and talk about some, manufacturing. Just a thought.
Yeah. Well, manufacturing is so exciting.
It can be exciting. These days, it can be super exciting.
Okay, let's go into that. What is super exciting for you with manufacturing?
So, having gone through, the wave of virus in China, which is now, mostly past, and having it come here and trying to time things in an optimum way where they started manufacturing and will potentially ship things but even at that, the cost of shipping now has gone up because of all of the constraints and everything like that, and talking to different manufacturers of where they are in the, like, now I think it's pretty much business as usual, but there were several weeks of, so what percentage of your workforce is actually working, or what are you doing to take precautions that they aren't getting sick, or how do you feel about this if they are, and how long can the virus last on inanimate objects while they're being shipped? Cool. Those kinds of conversations. And then also, conversely, on the other side, having long pack ship me masks because you couldn't get any here, and we're like, the CDC says don't. He's like, they're going to want you to eventually. We're just going to send you our extras because we don't need them anymore. Just surreal conversations that I was never planning on having in life, that have been had in the last couple weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely I thought about that. Like, I was like, we're out of masks here, but China has so many, and manufacturers are like sending me quotes, but like, I don't need 500 masks. Do I just give them to the hospital, or like, I don't know.
Oh, they didn't even give me quotes. They just sent me them. They were like, here, this is for you. You might need them. And I did. I'll pass a lot of them along to our local hospital. I think they were like, we don't want to store these. We've got all this stuff now. What do we do with it? Which was nice, but also just strange. And I joke about defaulting back to the zombie apocalypse, but honestly, it's been a great coping mechanism as well. So speaking of sandbox games, our first game being a massive zombie apocalypse sandbox game, going back and playing in that sandbox, because at least it's a fantasy version of how bad things can get. And so it's not real. You would think that you'd want to shy away from it, but actually is, I don't know, psychologically comforting that I know how I would cope if it got worse. Is strange as well.
Well, so I'm playing this other, it's kind of sandboxy of a game, Persona 5, which is a video game, where it goes on the other spectrum of it. So, like, you were playing with zombies, and mine is just like, I'm going to school, I'm reading books, hanging out with girls, like, choosing, like, which friend do you want to hang out with today? Like,
so that was, right, there's the two extremes. So I wrote... in maybe 3 weeks ago, it took me 4 days. I wrote an entire print and place 1 or 2 player standalone adaptation of Zpocalypse. It just because. And went down that rabbit hole of let's do something. And I actually haven't since then have been doing other work that I actually need to be doing, so I haven't had time to play test it because I just want to release it. Be like, here, have a thing I made because I could, but it took no time because psychologically I was there. But then in the evenings I was like, Star Trek Next Generation, where everything makes sense and everything is orderly and everybody behaves with dignity and respect towards each other. I'm in. That was my other extreme.
So if we go back to the sandbox game thing,
Yeah.
like you said, well, if you're in the right mind space, like you can just really like take off and go.
Yes.
So like, how would you get yourself into that like really like productive? Like, I am thinking about zombies and I know exactly how this would go.
So when you're doing something, all right. So I can't talk about the broad, like how must this be done for everyone. I can tell you what I do and my approach, and then I can compare it to what Zach's approach is, which is extremely different, which is why we work so well together. I go about it from, I am character first. That is my focus. I can wrap around because I'm from a narrative-driven place of writing short stories and plays, so everything is based on the motivation of a person. So I tend to develop the characters first, and that informs me how they will behave in the world, and then helps me shape the world. So when we started, so to give the example of Zpocalypse, when we started, Zach, coming from the other end, likes to build the world first, and see how that's going to. So, how do the zombies move? How does movement work? How does fighting and combat work? How does tower of defense work? Of defense, building up defenses against the zombies coming in, or how they break them down. How long does it take to craft them? That's his go-to. So we meet in the middle pretty well, and I feel like that's makes it easier for us because we have two people coming at it from two different angles. I do it. Who are your survivors, and what is motivating them, and what is important to them, which leads me to what are the objectives of the win conditions of playing this game. And of course, Zach is giving me, well, here's the outside scenarios that are augmenting those goals or forcing goals to happen. So a lot of it is very thematic based driven decisions of how to build your mechanisms.
Yeah. Oh, I really like that. Like, I've never thought of design like that before? Like it's usually like, oh, it's theme based or mechanic based, but like you've broken down theme into like characters and world. Like, is there any other like areas you think in the thematicness?
I mean, so you have, let's see, you can have timeline crunch things, so time being a factor, as well as I mean, I'm trying to think of it, and I'm trying to think of different games of what different constraints would be. But you have the motivation of what your objective is, which a lot of narrative driven is character based, but also scenario based, so environment based, or some combination thereof. You have whatever abilities those characters have that augment it. So you're also designing whether it's a fantasy thing, so you're getting better magical powers or better tokens or artifacts or potions or what have you, or in something like a zombie apocalypse, you're getting better weaponry or you're gaining skills on how to use said weapons because you were a housewife and now suddenly, and you don't just suddenly become a ninja overnight. As nice as that might be in a zombie apocalypse. So you have that, and then you have the weapons themselves, which, you know, are found objects and tend to get better level up in any of those genres. You have the whatever the bad is, the zombies, the monsters, the plague if you're in pandemic, whatever the evil is, or the thwart, the deterrent. And how are they moving? And is that motivated by something specific, the need for brains, or is it motivated just let's math this out and how is this going to be the most challenging? You have a time crunch typically in a lot of them because otherwise you are doing just an RPG that goes on for 8 weeks. So what is the finite need for, are you killing people off? Are you the troubled life of Billy Kerr? Are you saving this person and pushing to get the information to try to figure out who this person is before they die because they're in critical condition? So there's a lot of time crunch aspects to it, which also serve a purpose of, because it's supposed to be a tabletop, like a board game, not making it a campaign.
So say that we've been working on a sandbox game and like you have the world and the characters and such, but like you don't know where to end it.
Yep.
Do you have any tips on like figuring out like, oh, okay, so if you want like a 2-hour game, how do
I break it down?
Yeah.
I've gotten pretty good at least knowing my game of, okay, so here's a combat scenario. How long does it take for 2 players, 3 players, 4 players? But does number of players change the time of a combat? Does number of players change the time of a downtime of whether it's upkeep, whether it's crafting, whether it's some sort of narrative-driven storytelling, choose your own adventure type of thing? How much time does it take? And I break it down into whatever the beats are of that game, because they're not all going to have all the same thing. And then I factor in, does the number of players change that? So in a narrative-driven thing, you're going to try to mitigate it as much as possible. So narrative-driven, if you're getting to a choice point, always trying to have a leader at any given time to be the deciding factor whether there's a debate or not, so it doesn't turn into a ultimate werewolf, everybody debating and nobody ever votes on who the werewolf is every night kind of scenario. You have this much time without putting a timer in, because that seems too top down, forcing. I also don't like timers. I find that to be very Deus Ex Machina, heavy handed. So what makes the gameplay make it feel natural that you only have a certain amount of time? Which is also a narrative driven thing. If you can emotionally have somebody buy into it, that there's a time crunch. So also scenarios, if you have a great engine, but you have no what's the end goal, then maybe there's lots of little end goals and it's a scenario driven thing. And you don't have to have one big epic, here's the ending. a lot of people solve it by, here's the culmination of a boss fight. I mean, that's been a tried and true method since the dawn of games. But you don't have to have that. You could have the, for zombies, it's, do you find the cure, or do you find the safe haven that is zombie free? You can do it without having a boss fight, but we've been trained to have that kind of emotional buy-in to want something like that. So it's really hard to get away with it without having some sort of final satisfaction while you're playing the game is the challenge.
So you bring up emotional, like being ready for the end, like having that emotional buildup. Do you try to have like an emotional like roller coaster, like just building up once to the final boss? Like,
no, I don't. I try to do a lot more nuance. If you look at an opera or a symphony or baseball, or there are a lot of things that I know it's a weird segue, but there are a lot of things in our lives that really, if you're going to do something for an extended period of time, and for me, it's over a half an hour, where you have to you can't just have tension building without some sort of relief. If you watch a TV series and it has a major story arc, you never have every single episode be building the story arc. They are always those, whatever, a goofball one-off silly segue one, or you psychologically the tension can't build over a long period of that time without, at some point, we need the relief. So our only recourse is to become disinterested and stop buying it. So psychologically or emotionally, whichever way you want it, you have to have highs and lows. You have to have moments of humor to offset, I think, the tension. Now, it doesn't have to be slapstick. Like Dead of Winter isn't going to have a slapstick moment. That would not fit in with the theme, and that would just pull you out of the game entirely as well. You have to be smart about what kind of relief you have, but you have to have those moments, I think, or just after a while you just get fatigue of feeling that tension. So it can't always be driven to do you have to have a moment of ridiculousness to offset a moment of horror, or if it's all silly, a moment of seriousness. So after a while you're like, okay, I laughed and now I'm done. You laugh yourself sober, as it were. So yes, I like to do as much of that as possible personally.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I really like a variety of emotion, because, like, as you say, one emotion just gets dull and you stop feeling it. So Matt's question was, what do you find is an effective way to market Sandbox games, and how do you tie the theme and the world into driving excitement about the game?
So marketing for Sandbox games to me is the most boots on the ground type of marketing. The more fans you have, the better off you will do. This is true. I mean, when you have a lot of fans, obviously somebody's going to listen to their friend's advice more than they're going to listen to the television's advice on something. But for a Sandbox game, because a piece of it that we haven't really talked about is that most Sandbox games, almost in all of them, are going to have a lot of components, and therefore they're going to be a big box game with lots of bits and pieces, and therefore be a higher price point. So if you're buying into a big box game, you're probably buying into a system, a series. It's a commitment that's beyond let's play Codenames, or let's play, help me out here. What have I played recently? Morals is great. I love it. It's a 2-player with mushrooms and everything, but that's hey, this is something fun. We're stuck indoors and there's only 2 of us, and this is a good, we'll just play this kind of a thing when we want to. If I'm committed to Gloomhaven, if I'm committed to Descent, if I'm committed to Folklore, The Affliction, that means, yes, I don't have to play it for 8 weeks, but if I'm going to pay that much money over time, I'm probably going to want to have the ability and the desire to play it over that period of time. So having a fan base and building one from the start is, I think, far more essential in the marketing efforts. I do, you know, folklore, specifically the designers, before they even brought it to us, had spent 2 years bringing it to a lot of different conventions and playtesting it and getting people to get excited about it. And then we spent another 1.5 years doing that before we ever went to, so it was 3.5 years of people playing it at conventions, talking to us, giving us their feedback, giving us their feels on the game before we ever went to a Kickstarter. And Kickstarter also being a social platform and engaging with the people who are funding it, and subsequently 2 other Kickstarters for expansions, having, social forums for them to talk to, making sure that you respond in those social forums. That has a bigger component to me than any kind of ad. Now, the ads are great because I can show the pretty art and the pretty miniatures, and that has a high impact as well. But that has a high, first look at impact. What makes people say, yeah, I'm going to throw somewhere between over $100 to I don't know at this point, at least several $100s towards a game, is going to have to be because there's other people who you are also, because you're now buying into an experience. And that's the thing about it, about board games in general. You're buying an experience. You're not just buying a physical item. You're also buying I'm buying an experience. And for a sandbox game, I'm buying into an experience with a community that you have to, I think, really sell.
So does it feel easier in a respect to go to Kickstarter with a sandbox game or a game with a lot of theme and world around it?
I think it's almost necessary. I had this conversation and talking about manufacturing. If you're a retailer, you are not going to be able to provide for every big box game out there the experience. Obviously, the top sellers, but even at that, if you look at CMON's sales in retail, even though they are a big name for the industry, and even though they have a product that's very, well made and consistent, and they have a very good marketing machine and all of that, their retail is not great. They are a Kickstarter company. And they are a Kickstarter company. And if you look at their direct retail products, even though, which funnily enough, I actually prefer a lot of their direct retail products as games go. I think they're quite good. Those aren't the ones they don't do anything in retail. They are a flash in the pan. And because that kind of a game, the big box, lots of miniatures, lots of components, lots of art, is super expensive. And if you're doing something super expensive like that in retail, you have a lot more pieces of the pie that have to be shared if you're going to retail. It's not direct to the consumer, which is the Kickstarter backer. So if you're direct to consumer, you can lower the overall price of the game because you have a lot less people you have to pay. And if you're doing retail, you're paying distribution, you're paying the retailer, the retailers are buying it for a percentage. You're getting a much smaller piece of the pie, and there's a lot more components and moving parts to organize and then sell. So yes, if you're doing a sandbox game, typically it's also going to have a lot of components, and that means that it's going to much more likely be a Kickstarter game. Not necessarily because it's a sandbox game, but because most sandbox games have that additional component to them.
So where should you get started when you're trying to tie your theme into marketing?
So much. You're going to want to feel out what, just like in design, you need to find out what is resonating with your customer base. We in the industry get really wrapped up in a lot of debates, which I try to shy away from, but I'm going to talk about right now. Don't beat me up. There's a lot of debate about why should, stereotypes of what how women are portrayed in games, and why do we always have to have fantasy, or like why are there always the same themes? Why do we see the same theme over and over again? I'm so sick of that theme. Or there's certain conversations that in our microcosm of an industry we have over and over and over, and I see them play out the same questions with the same debates, and then it turns into name calling in many of our social media forums. And what I notice is it's like the same people who are having them every time. You don't see anybody outside of that. So what it also is telling me is it's not pulling in anybody new, any of these conversations.
Mhm.
And then I step back and I look at numbers. So going to Gamma, the absolute only thing I wanted to attend was the one that I go to every year is, where is the money going? What does the market look like? Like there's a lot of other cool stuff to go to and listen to, but I want to look at numbers. I want to see hard, cold facts of what's selling and where. What is selling? Anybody going to be shocked by this? Are collectible card games.
Oh.
In our industry. Biggest moneymaker, and that's Magic, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Board games are so much smaller of a number for being so much more expensive to produce. And numbers-wise, we are over-glutted, and therefore, because there are so many publishers pushing out so many games so frequently, that our product has way out increased the demand for it. And part of that is because we are not trying to reach out to a broader market. We say we want to, but then you get online and you get debates of such minuscule fights about certain things. So if you're going to do a sandbox game, you have to accept some things. You're marketing to a finite source. You're not casting a wide net. I know this about me. I am a boutique company making bespoke games for a certain demographic, and I have to accept that about myself. And I also have to accept that while I don't always want to go with a stereotype about how women are in those games, that there is a huge demographic of the people who are buying my game who like that. So how do I balance that with my own self-respect? That's another story altogether. But things like that, where you're marketing and you have to understand that you have, so all the people who dump on KDM, how much money does KDM make on Kickstarter? Because that's what the people who buy KDM want. And you can fight against it and you can argue about it. And again, I'm going to get beat up for this, I'm sure. This is why I don't engage on social media about it. But you have to know that. If you want to go to a bigger demographic, you also have to go to what a bigger demographic wants to play. And what does a bigger demographic want to play? Monopoly. Sorry. Candyland. So, like, or, you know, that's what, like, so Funko Pops. I'm actually really psyched about Funko Pops because Funko Pops is really only one step up from all of that, gameplay-wise. If you play, have you all played any of the Funko Pop games? They're not heavy on the strategy. Let's be honest. I understand that. But what they serve is people who already like a toy. It's a much bigger demographic and are at least now buying into a slightly, the tiniest, I know, but a slightly heavier weight of gameplay. So that now we can draw them in. Now we can get them to a Codenames. Great. Now we can get them and finally eventually get them. But if we don't start there, they're never going to get to my games. Ever. And I have to accept that. And I also have to accept that the people who I'm marketing to and who are buying my games are of a certain demographic. Now I can tweak it and try to make it more inclusive, but I also have to, I have to do it in a way that's also mindful of who are my people who are spending money. And that's a hard thing. It's a daily, be mindful of not being disrespectful to anyone, and try to be as inclusive as possible, but also understand that isn't going to translate into sales. Yeah, it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing. So I'm not sure where we started with the marketing question about that, but that is something that you have to be very mindful of. And that's also why you're much more successful, I think, when you're marketing boots on the ground, where you can have a conversation about the game and see who's resonating and what's resonating, and have a question about like pushing. If you're going to push boundaries, how are you pushing them, and how is that resonating? What does the best? Because yes, I would love to change the world, but I also need to eat.
Yeah, that is a very important.
It's a balance. It's an absolute balance.
Yeah, like I definitely learned that one of my games, Dreams of Tomorrow, the logo was first like a super girly font and super rainbow, and that wasn't doing that well. So I like took a step back and I was like, oh yeah, it's because it's super rainbow girly. I can bring people into the rainbows and like once they buy the game, but like the cover, like we changed the logo to be like way more sci-fi. And that was a lot more appealing to people. And like while I didn't want to admit that, it was like, look at the demographics. Most board game players are men, so.
But even at that, like I am okay. Like honestly, I'm okay with having the pinup look of a girl in a game. I would just also like other things as well. I'm a yes and person, not a let's look at that and just be angry that it's objectifying women. I also have to be mindful that if I only have women like that, it's going to lead into that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's either way, it's a balance. And is that going to positively influence how my game is marketed, or negatively? Is it going to bring attention? What kind of attention? Is that attention going to bring money, or is that attention just going to make people laugh and then walk away? Like talking about it, like that's a part of marketing that like is tough, because there's plenty of times where I look at characters and I'm like, okay, we got our Barbie character, cool. Can we also have and that's the trick of it in my mind is, but also I also don't need to like, if I bring it up, then the focus becomes about that and not the game.
Mm-hmm.
Which to me is also crazy. Like, why can we talk about the gameplay? No, cool. Awesome. Let's talk more about the art.
Yeah, I really
but
like
that is what sells the game.
Yeah. Well, your standpoint of like the yes and like having the things that will appeal to every different player type.
Yeah. Yes and
demographic.
You want some. I want a happy little character that looks more like, well, like a mushroom. Thanks, Mario Brothers. I want like a cute little weird glob character. That's what always makes me happy. But I know that I'm not the person that's usually like, I'm not the normal. If I like something, I'm like, oh, the general public's gonna hate that. That's pretty much my litmus test. Oh, do I think that's cool? We're not going with that. What else you got?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there's a lot of nuance to that, and there's also a lot of how do you handle it that makes a difference as well. And that's why I'm saying engaging your public, getting them to buy in, because a lot of times once I get to a certain point, I don't have to be the defender of my product. The fan base will be. And as long as so then it becomes a matter of just making sure that the fan base isn't overzealous, as it were. That we can all play nice, that we can all be friends, and that somebody can have a different opinion than theirs and they don't have to kill them on my behalf. I appreciate it, but no thank you. So I do a lot of, I guess for marketing, I also do a lot of making sure that I'm reaching out to my fan base and keeping in contact with them and seeing how they feel. And that is something that if you're starting out, you have to have a slow build and you have to have patience, which is really hard when you're like, I've made this game, share with the world. Well, you have to have, it doesn't just automatically happen. It is absolutely, I don't know, like going out and making friends. You can't, one person at a time. You can't just, well, I guess you can if you leverage celebrities and things like that, but I don't think it lasts in those cases. I think you still have to have an ongoing engagement with your fan base. You can have a quicker jumping off point, maybe, but you're never going to keep those people unless you have some sort of relationship with them. And for campaign style games, for sandbox style games, you need a relationship with your fan base.
So how often would you say that you should reach out to your fan base?
I go on the folklore Facebook page, which is the biggest one, daily. I don't always. I post fairly regularly. I comment or like daily, and then they joke because when somebody tags my name so that it comes up as a notification, it's a summoning. So they're summoning me,
Mhm.
like I'm a demon, and they've cast a spell. Um, where and some of those I do respond to, and some of them I don't. So that it is a kind of a mercurial thing. But that's the how I've set it up. Also, because some of the questions, if it's an opinion question, I can't give you an opinion on what I think is your best thing to buy online. I'm just going to sound like a shell. Like, ask other members of the fan base those kinds of questions. I can do it when I'm at this, our in the convention hall and we're there to sell. But if it's a community page, I'm there to answer questions about rules. I'm okay with like I've written pieces on how to play the best 2-player game, how to play the best, like things like that. If you want my opinion, great. If you're saying should I buy this? Obvious, my answer is yes. So ask somebody who doesn't have a very biased opinion, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I present it that way. And even at that, so marketing tactics that way. If you're doing a sandbox game, which is going to have a long-term, lots of buy-ins, you can't do high pressure sales and expect to retain a lot of those people. You might get the initial sale, but you're probably going to get a lot of people who then either are very annoyed and complain about it or won't come back and buy more. So it is absolutely not a love them and leave them kind of marketing and sales effort when you're doing this. It has to be much more of a, what are you excited about? Why are you excited about this? Let's talk about how you're excited, but I can't just be like, buy it, buy it, buy it, which I have seen, and I see that it typically doesn't do well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing. You're excited, and sometimes it's not even like the person is trying to be a used car salesman. I think it's genuinely they're excited about their own game, and they've made it, especially first-time designers or first-time publishers who are so excited about their game, and they just want to share with you it, and they don't realize that you're like keep taking, like the person just keeps taking another step back, and they're like following them and leaning and be like, and another thing, and another thing. You can't. It can't be that kind of relationship when it's a campaign style game. They have to feel the excitement. You can't just reach in there and shove it in their hearts. You can't. It doesn't work. It just scares them.
Yeah.
Turns out it just scares them.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that. Well, especially like if you're at a convention and you're like, "Hey, please listen to me talk about this thing I'm really excited about." Like a lot of people will think that it is like doing you a favor to listen to you, but like at the end of the day, like or at the end of a convention, like I am so exhausted. Like I've started just like
Oh yeah.
talk to somebody, I'm like, "Hey, do you want to know more about this?" I can certainly tell you like so much about it, but like I want the buy-in from the person before I start going on, because otherwise I'll just get really exhausted talking to someone that is not excited and it's just waiting to go somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, I think we all, everybody here has been to multiple conventions, so the experience is exhausting for everyone in general. So when you're walking down the aisle in a vendor hall, and every single booth is like, "Hey, how's it going? Can I talk to you?" It's even when you want to, it's exhausting. Um, and that's because that person does want something from you, wants you to hear about their game, wants you to purchase it, and you want to. So there's also that emotional struggle of I want all the things and I can't have all the things and I have to budget it. And now somebody is factoring into my whole mental gymnastics of what am I buying. It's hard. So, you have to be mindful of that as well.
So, what's been the easiest theme or game for you to market?
Folklore, The Affliction.
And why was that?
Because it already has we built an established fan base. So I have a lot of people who come because they've already heard of it. They already know. I have retailers who have people asking for it. So it makes it easier because I'm not the only person doing the work. I've got plenty of people out there who are telling other people about it who want to have it. So that makes it a lot easier. All of our games, I would say, have the benefit if we spend a lot of time making sure that they all have beautiful art that's creative and interesting to look at, that tells a story immediately with the imagery of it, so that kind of a thing, there's already that buy-in. Grimslingers is a perfect example of that. That game sells on the box art alone, which is great because most people buy it thinking it's a collectible card game, and it's not, and that makes it harder to explain when they're buying it. Like, okay, do you play collectible card games? Maybe you don't want this game then. And then looking at me and being like, it's not going to be intuitive to you. It's going to be counterintuitive to what you do is a common conversation. But if they just look at it and go, ooh, pretty, I want it, it's much harder to be like, well, why do you want it? And I'm just like, okay, come back if you have questions. Have fun. So, making sure things are visual and pretty is easy. And so something like a Grimslingers, which sells really quickly, or Bears because it's cute, that makes it very easy visually. But Folklore is the easiest because Folklore already has plenty of people talking about it. That I don't have to, I can say, hey, go on BGG. If you don't, if you think I'm just trying to sell you, which I am, go look at other people's opinions and then come back if you want it. That makes it a lot easier to do, to show what other people are saying.
So the alternative to that is, what's been the hardest theme or game to market?
I mean, I think, so Zpocalypse Now, I think we started in the heyday of zombies, and now it's a little bit more challenging. I guess it's harder to market, but I don't mind because it's our baby and it's our first game, and there will always be a Zpocalypse because I will go back to that well because it was our company's first game. It's not necessarily because of the game or the theme. It's because we always default back to that. When we want to come together as a team and feel closer as a team, we will work on Zpocalypse. I don't know if looking back, I definitely, like, when we started working on it, I was like, I like horror. I've always liked horror. Zombies were never my go-to. And I can remember, like, a couple weeks in for the first game, like, having a meltdown and being like, I just want to write about unicorns and twinkly things with sparkles. Can I please take a break? And Jeff was like, no, we have deadlines. You have to write more about rot. I'm sorry. But now it's so familiar, and it's not about the topic. It's about our team being a team. So it's hard to market because there's I get a lot of eye rolls and, no, zombies. But it's okay because I'm okay with just doing it for my personal love of working on it, and that being our first world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So Matt had a question. Where do you see the market for educational games going, given the light of current unpleasantness, and how is it affecting education?
Huge. I actually have had to turn down several different, because background, I was a teacher for 12 years. I have a master's in education, and I wrote a lot of games for the education world before I left. And so I had several different people who know me be like, hey, how do you feel about writing a campaign for, American history that a teacher could teach online for 8 weeks? And if you do it right now, we'll pay you this. And me being like, I've got my own stuff. I'm so sorry. I would love to, because the money looks great right now, and pooling, like, so on the one hand, you know, you've got, and that's the other thing. You have teachers who are trying to, and it's amazing how much they have to do, but taking their lesson plans and figuring out a way to put them on whatever platform their district has decided is the platform and making the best of it, whether they are familiar with it, competent at it, have better resources at their disposal that they're not allowed to use because it's not sanctioned or not. Like they have to, so there's a lot of that. And there has been a lot of really quick reaching out that, you know, has some degree of success. And it also is from district to district. So I do think that teachers are trying to do that. I think a lot of it is defaulting to what I like to call the, let's just use flashcards as like a Candyland and a Candyland experience, which is still better than nothing. I'm going to give you, it's still better than nothing, but, and I'm trying, there's actually a really good online, I'll have to look it up and maybe just message you it later to share a resource that I've seen some amazingly creative things. It's a online education. You pay for a subscription and then kids can go on and learn stuff. And then also you can go on as a educator. And so I've seen some super cool things like how to build your own Hogwarts castle that's talking about geometry, but they've put it in terms of you're building Hogwarts. So they're setting it up so that you're like things like that, that are using a lot of creative aspects to do the same lessons. And that was one. So I was offered another thing to come up with campaigns that were, which I've done, and I just don't have time to like segue them, leverage them onto it. So like an RPG for the Oregon Trail that, you know, because kids may or may not have the Oregon Trail. I feel like everybody could play the Oregon Trail, but who knows? They wanted a more teacher driven kind of a thing. Or the American Revolution and things like that. And I've already done a lot of those that I had created, but having to put them into a database and having to script out what the teacher would say and everything like that I just didn't have the time. But I know that people are trying to do that. And I think it's amazing. And I'm hoping they don't lose it after all this goes away, because I think ideally I am somebody who firmly believes it's a better way to reach a greater number of kids when you turn things into play.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, when you're so focused on whether or not you're going to make the test, and so you have to study these 5 things over and over again. Why is everybody laughing? What did I miss?
Oh, Matt, he said kids dying of dysentery might hit a little close to home these days.
For the record, I did this for like 7 years, where I had an Oregon Trail, like, and so they'd be out at recess and like little factions negotiating like use of oxen to get over the mountains in exchange for how many, you know, bales of grain and stuff like that. And she'd be like, "What are they doing?" I'm like, "They're traveling on the Oregon Trail." They're like, "Why aren't they playing?" I'm like, "They are. I win." Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like instead of like going and playing soccer, they're like in these deep negotiations, so they're ready for history class. And I had 2 years where I had 1 year where I had somebody die, which I made really hard. It was like statistically almost impossible to get the dice rolls to actually die of any of the diseases. You just got them and then talked about how you worked them through. I had somebody die. A character, obviously, not the actual child. And I was like, I'm gonna get so many notes from home. Oh God. It was a girl. She invited all the girls from the class over that day. They had a faux funeral after class at her house for her character, and then built a new one. And the parents were like, "This was amazing. I can't believe you did." I'm like, I thought I was going to be fired. Nope, they loved it. So they had a mock funeral for the character at her house, and then she came in the next day with the new character. And we moved on with our lives. And then a subsequent year, like several years later, I had because each table or each group was a wagon. And one wagon, somebody did get sick, and to prevent the spread of disease, the rest of the wagon decided to murder that one. That one, I was like, what? What? And that also did not end in me being fired. That one ended in a learn of how to do your civic duty, because we stopped everything and segued into how the judicial system works in the United States and what due process means. And then moved on with our lives, and then got to be new characters. And the parents also thought that was great. I'm like, how am I'm rolling 20 with parents? It's amazing. I have no idea why I didn't. I fully expected both times to have like there be parents who were like, this is not acceptable. How can you? Nope. Apparently my handling the situation made it okay.
I mean,
who knew?
Like
it was terrifying. I was terrified both times. Both times I'm like, this is and then I had one kid who had actually played D&D who said that he was secretly a Kraken.
Okay.
And so I made him roll every day because he was not in a ecosystem that would be conducive to being a Kraken, since it was a grasslands and not, the ocean. He had to roll to see if he died every day. And then eventually I had second graders come in and say they were from the Arkham Asylum back in East, and they needed to take him because he had escaped. He was a patient that had escaped, and he had to go help the second grade teacher for the rest of the day. And we all learned a valuable lesson about how to play the correct role-playing game in the correct situation. Yeah. These are things that have happened in my life.
Well, it seems like you lived a really exciting life as a teacher.
Oh yeah, no, they were some valuable playtesters. I will give you that.
Well, so we're almost to the end, but Joel had one last question, which was, in Sandbox games, is it more important to have a story or leave space for players to make their own story?
So, this is a great question. And I think there's room for both ends of the spectrum, because you're going to have players who want different things. I think it's always important to at least start with a lot more scaffolding if it's a world that you really want, because you need them to be established in your world. So you don't have, say, a Kraken in the grasslands in the prairie during, 1800s United States. So you need to do a lot more, I think, heavy support of your world at the beginning. But I also think it's amazing when you can allow for room for creativity, and you get some amazing stuff. And you get a lot of amazing feedback from players that way as well. That creates a lot of dynamic engagement with your fan base, which leads to them further playing. But you have to be careful with that too, because if they wanted to be playing an RPG, they'd be playing an RPG. So there's a balance, and it's a constant back and forth of how much is too much, how much is enough, and what kind of a player are you working with. For Folklore, we have our own build your own story adventure creation kit, so that at any given point, if you want to just make your own story, you can make one from scratch. And BGG is now full of people who have made their own stories and posted them, and we think that's great. So if you get tired of playing the stuff we've written, there's a whole body of stuff that we had nothing to do with, but except for it's our world. I think the more you do it, pros and cons. If you're working on something that is too structured, then yes, somebody who's an RPG player who's playing is gonna get bored. If you don't leave them any room, then why are they playing this? Why aren't they playing a Euro? If you give it too open-ended, then if it's a tabletop game, there's still a finite number of choices, and you don't have, like, say, a DM to do that on the fly changes to go down the whatever segue you've chosen to go. Then they're going to be frustrated because they're going to be like, let's do this, and then there's no way for them to go in that direction because the game doesn't allow for it. So it's a balance. It's a challenge. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's what that's what I got for you.
Oh, I think it gave an answer. You have to have enough.
You have to have enough. Yeah. Without breaking your own game.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much, Julie. You were amazing as always.
Thank you.
And people can look up Greenbrier Games if they want to find some amazing Sandbox games. But thank you all for being here. The next one is Wednesday at 7 p.m. CDT. And the Discord link will be in the chat as soon as I put it there.